be seated. All right, we are in the book of Esther this evening, and it's my purpose, if God permits, to go through the entire book with you. And when I said a few minutes ago that my intention was to read every line because I don't want to summarize narrative, I realize that there may be parts of Scripture that we might give you an overview of, the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles. We may not read every part of the genealogy. There may be portions of the Law of Moses where we're going through detailed ceremonial laws, and we might summarize some of those sections at times. But when we're dealing with the narratives of Scripture and when we're dealing with didactic portions that are intended to teach and expound God's Word, those are sections we do not want to skip over at all in our teaching. I would rather read the book of Esther to you tonight and not have time for exposition and come back later to do that than to skip over the book of Esther, which is the one inspired part of the evening, in order to simply share with you my thoughts about it. But that does mean that I'm going to have to try to be very brief in my comments. And so we're going to read large sections, and I'm going to make general observations and then offer some application at the end. Now remember that the book of Esther belongs to the post-exilic literature, and it is very clearly historical literature. I'm going to emphasize that as we go through it tonight. Many, many features of the book point to the fact that this is in fact historical narrative. It relates a story concerning the Jews that occurred between Ezra chapters 6 and 7. This would be during the time of Xerxes, as we know him in history, or Ahasuerus in most of your Bibles. He reigned from 486 BC to 465, and clearly whoever wrote this book was an eyewitness, perhaps, of this period and maybe even of the events themselves, because he writes in a way that indicates an intimate familiarity with the Persian government, with the proceedings of the court. He also doesn't use any Greek vocabulary, not just Greek words, but Greek terms that would be read back into the post-exilic literature. That indicates that he's writing prior to Alexander's conquests and the Hellenization of the ancient Near East. I want to start with a couple of quotes from an introduction to the book of Esther. The writers in this work say this, quote, "In some respects, the book of Esther may well be the most unusual book in the Old Testament. We ordinarily think of the Bible as preeminently a book revealing to us the nature of God, both through His attributes and through His deeds. Yet in the book of Esther, God is not mentioned, nor is there reference to worshiping Him through prayer or sacrifice. On its surface, the book appears to be a thoroughly secular story of Jews who continue to live on in the diaspora rather than identify with the restoration community back in Jerusalem. The account describes one more chapter in the recurring threats to the existence of the Jews and how that threat was met. Yet, on closer inspection, the book is deeply involved with other chapters of biblical revelation." End quote. Now, when I teach the book of Esther, I've told you before that the title I like to use is God Amid the Shadows. That is not original to me. I'm stealing it completely from a preacher whose work on this book I read he wrote in the early part of the 20th century. God Amid the Shadows, because the name of God is never mentioned in the book. Not the word for God, not the word for Lord, not the word for Yahweh. God is nowhere present explicitly in the book of Esther, and yet His presence is seen in every line and on every page. God remains hidden in the shadows, and yet the book of Esther was included in the Hebrew canon and rightly included by the early Christians in the Christian canon of Scripture because it so clearly speaks to us about the wonderful works of God. But it is a very unusual book. It's a book that doesn't preach to us. It doesn't prophesy to us. It does not show us explicitly even the community of the Jews as a believing community, although I'm going to argue tonight that that's the proper way to read it. Now, in this introduction to the book, the authors go on to say this, quote, "The author's delight in irony is shown by his frequent reports of reversals of fortune. Particular actions or states of affairs often result in the opposite of the expected result. Haman, who intends to destroy Mordecai and the Jews, ultimately destroys himself along with his own family. The gallows Haman erects for Mordecai becomes the instrument of his own demise. Haman's edict would have plundered the wealth of the Jews, but the story ends with Haman's wealth in Jewish hands. Haman, who writes the script for what he perceives would be his own glorification, becomes the royal agent to effect the glorification of Mordecai. Haman, for a time, possessed the royal signet, but it eventually would be Mordecai's to do with as he saw fit, end quote. And those examples could be multiplied, by the way, and the authors of that work continue to develop that idea in the following paragraph, that one of the things you're going to notice in the book of Esther are all of these contrasts, right? All of these reversals of fortune. And I want you to be aware of that as we begin to read, because I'm not going to try to draw out every one of those. If we were going to preach through the book of Esther, we would do that. We would, each chapter, we would say, do you see the contrast here? Look at the contrast between this character and that character, or between this group of people and that group of people, or this intention and that intention. I just simply wanted to read that quote to you because as we move through the book quickly tonight, I want your senses to already be attuned to that channel, so that you say, oh, I recognize there is another example of irony. There is another reversal where what you expect to happen, in fact, the exact opposite is what occurs. Now, there are two themes that I want to also put on your radar before we begin to read the text. The first is God's sovereignty and providence. We said that God is amid the shadows in this book, and yet, once again, we see Him in every line and on every page. Pay attention to the fact that God is the one who is ultimately guiding and governing all of these affairs, even though we do not see His name mentioned anywhere. And the second theme is a complementary theme, although some might imagine it to be antithetical, and that is the theme of human responsibility and faithfulness. The sovereignty of God does not release men and women from acting courageously in an hour of trial. In fact, we're going to argue tonight that one of the things we learn from the book of Esther is that it is the sovereignty of God that releases men and women to act courageously in an hour of trial. In other words, because we know God is in control, even though He may be hidden in shadow, we don't have to be able to see Him clearly. We don't have to be able to know His will explicitly in a given circumstance to be able to act by faith and with courage in a manner that is consistent with what He has revealed to be His overall will. So let's begin. I'm going to read most of the book by chapters. All right, the chapters generally divide the scenes of this drama. So Esther chapter 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the province being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple on silver rods and marble pillars, and the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to King Vashti according to law? Because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes. When they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Medes and the Persians, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another, who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the language of his own people. Well, we have actually historical records of this king, better known to us as Xerxes, in the history of Herodotus. And what he tells us about the character of this man, it confirms actually what we see here in the book of Esther. In fact, there is almost certainly a reference in Herodotus to this very feast that's being described. Now, one of the things that is challenging about the book of Esther is how to properly interpret it. And we meet these interpretive difficulties right here at the beginning in chapter 1. When Vashti is ordered by King Ahasuerus to come before the princes wearing her royal crown to show off her beauty to the princes, what are you to make of this? She refuses to come, and the king is incensed, and the princes are offended, and they are very concerned about this outbreak of feminism, that now all of the wives are going to disregard their husbands, because if Vashti can get away with it, well then surely the rest of us can as well. When you see how commentators or preachers and pastors interpret this passage, you have a clue about how the rest of the book is going to go, for good or ill. Now, traditionally, the Jews interpreted this request as Ahasuerus telling Vashti to come in wearing her crown and nothing else, in order to display her beauty. And so he is a boorish, drunken person. Some people interpret the text in that way. Here, he is a womanizer, which he was historically, and they say, therefore, Vashti is a virtuous woman. Well, on the other hand, some people will say, well, Vashti and her women have been drinking for a week as well, and maybe some of this liquid courage has encouraged her to defy the king's order. Whether it was an immoral order or not, we really don't know, and maybe she is being rebellious. Now, here's my argument, right? I don't think we're supposed to be dogmatic about this particular question, because the Word of God is not clear. The point of the book of Esther is not to tell us who was right in this controversy in chapter 1. And it is entirely possible that neither of them are correct. Ahasuerus could be asking Vashti to do something that is immoral, and Vashti could be refusing in a non-virtuous way. The whole party is drunk, right? And the whole party are a bunch of hedonists. And I'm not expecting to find a hero in chapter 1. Instead, I'm looking for the circumstances in which God is going to do His great work. Vashti is not the hero here, and Ahasuerus is not the villain. In fact, their roles are largely incidental in this story, because the story is going to focus on how God works providentially to position Esther in the capital in order to save the Jews. And so what I would encourage you is don't overinterpret the text. Don't make Esther a social commentary on contemporary issues. It was not written about the Me Too movement. Ahasuerus and his counselors are concerned about Vashti's refusal and the broader implications of that, but the reason this is even discussed in Scripture is so that you understand how God used the drunken behavior of a fool to put one of His servants in a position of power and influence so that years later He could save His people. That's why this story is here. And so I'm not trying to take sides. If Ahasuerus is asking Vashti to come out naked except for her crown, well then obviously she's right to refuse to do that. But the point is we just don't know. And there are so many different dynamics here that to argue about that point, which people do, believe me, seems to me to miss the point and to be rather foolish. Now, as we come into chapter 2, take note of the fact that 4 years are passing between these two chapters. And during that time, Persia was at war with Greece and is soundly defeated in one important battle. But between chapter 1 and verse 3 and chapter 2 and verse 16, you'll notice that there is this 4-year interval. And so we pick up now the history in chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women. And let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan the citadel there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it was, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, then Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Each young woman's turn came to go in to King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months' preparation, according to the regulations for the women, for thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now when the term came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Now Josephus tells us at this point of the history that this king brought 400 virgins into his harem in order to have tryouts for a new queen. And hopefully we don't have to be too graphic here. You understand that this king would have many wives and many slave wives, the concubines. And for most of these young women, this would be kind of a one-and-done opportunity to meet with the king. And then they would be officially married to the king, but they would go into the second harem and probably never see him again. The queen would be the legal wife who was given the authority and position as queen, and that would be a distinction over and above all of the other women. Now, Persian custom actually said that the king had to select the queen, not necessarily the concubines and other wives that he might have, but the queen had to be selected from among the young women of 7 royal families. But this was contrary to the custom, and there is some precedent for that, even in an earlier part of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, some commentators interpret Esther as a compromised and corrupt collaborator. And at the risk of disappointing or offending tonight, I'm going to say I think that is a serious misread of the text. They will say this because she doesn't refuse the king's food, as Daniel did. She doesn't disclose her heritage, and she participates in this parade of women. But I would ask the question, how much freedom does she actually have? I'm not sure that she signed up for tryouts. I'm not sure but what the king doesn't simply go and fetch the women that he wants, sends out his servants and says to the young virgins who are unmarried, you are going to come with us. We have to be very careful about judging Esther where the Scriptures do not. If the Scriptures gave us an indication that this was immoral or worldly behavior that she is engaged in, that she is ashamed of her people, that might be a different matter. But instead, the text, if anything, seems to vindicate Esther as a heroine in the story, certainly shows to us Mordecai as the wise sage, and the text is very explicit that she is following Mordecai's counsel here. Now, all of that being said, let me say again just what I said in chapter 1. If you get bogged down interpreting that question, you are missing the point. The true hero of the story here is not Ahasuerus or Vashti. It's also not Esther or Mordecai. Because the real point of Esther is God's sovereign providence in delivering His people. Let's say, for example, that Esther is making foolish or even sinful choices. Let's say that Mordecai, for worldly reasons, is having her conceal her true identity and heritage. The point stands that God is using even those actions for the greater good of the work that He is determined to do. And so we see Esther brought into this program. She has 12 months to prepare for her time with the king. She goes in, she pleases the king more than all of the others, and she was made the new queen in place of Vashti in December of 479. At the same time, at the end of the chapter, we see Mordecai's promotion to a position of government responsibility. And one of the things you're going to see in this story is the rise of Mordecai corresponds to the fall of Haman. Mordecai is now rising to a position of prominence, and in that position, he has access to information about a plot against the king's life. He passes that information to Esther. She passes it to the king, probably not to the king directly, but to some of his administrative officials. The plot is thwarted, the king's life is saved, and a record, a minute, is recorded in the archives about that matter, and that's going to be very, very important when we come later to chapter 6. Let's go on to chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" Now it happened when they spoke to him daily and he would not listen to them that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, the lot, before Haman to determine the day and the month until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month, and a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, to the officials of all people, to every province according to its script, and to every people in their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus it was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. A copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people, that they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. 4 more years pass, notice verse 7. And Ahasuerus promotes Haman to the position of prime minister. Everyone is to bow the knee to Haman, and everyone does, except for Mordecai. Now this is important, and this is maybe a subtle point that sometimes is overlooked, but Mordecai does not appear to refuse to honor the king of Persia or the other princes and governors and officials that are in a position of superiority to him, but he does refuse to bow the knee to Mordecai. And if you're wondering about Mordecai's character, about Haman's character, I said that all backwards, didn't I? But you were following the point. Mordecai doesn't bow to Haman. Just read my mind, not my mouth. If you're wondering about Haman's character, look at how he responds to Mordecai's personal affront. Mordecai does not bow to Haman, and Haman in response says, "It's not enough to kill him. I want to wipe out all of his people." Now, all through the book of Esther, you are going to be thinking, how fortunate. What luck. It just so happened. There are all of these coincidences in the book that are indications. They're the fingerprints of God as He hides in the shadows. But the reverse is true as well. You have all of these coincidences that can only be explained in devilish and demonic ways. I mean, what kind of a person who is prime minister takes personal offense at the actions of one individual and says, in order to repay that, in order to avenge my honor, I'm going to wipe out all of his people? Everyone within the entire kingdom. I mean, you talk about grandiose and ungodly ambitions, right? That's Haman to a T. But do you think that this is a coincidence? Do you think that Haman just happens to have that bad of a character, right? Or do you think that there is some devilish plot behind it? Remember what we said Sunday night. Satan does not understand what work Messiah is coming to perform, but he knows that he's coming. Yahweh has already announced that. He knows that something lies ahead, and therefore it would be very much in Satan's interest to wipe out these Jews to whom the promises are given and with whom the covenant has been made. What you're seeing here is the outworking not just of a personal conflict, but a long-standing war between Yahweh and the forces of darkness. And one of the ways that you see that is in the way that the author identifies both Mordecai and Haman. Did you notice this? Mordecai is a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin, a descendant of Kish, the father of Saul. Haman is described as an Agagite, which identifies him with King Agag of Amalek. Do you remember in 1 Samuel chapter 15, this is a deliberate literary allusion. I'm not suggesting it's not historical. I am suggesting that the author of Esther wants you to pick up on this, right? In 1 Samuel chapter 15, God tells King Saul, go and utterly destroy the Amalekites, and Saul doesn't. He spares the best. He takes spoil. That's going to be important later in chapters 8, 9, and 10. He takes spoil. He plunders the Amalekites, brings the best of their possessions back to enrich himself, or, as he says, to sacrifice to the Lord. And he spares Agag. And because he spares Agag, God destroys Saul. Do you see the way that the author is signaling the history here? This is not just about Haman and Mordecai. This is about the war between the people of God and the descendants of the serpent. In fact, the whole book of Esther could be read as the rest of the story from 1 Samuel chapter 15. Haman cast lots. And I've given you a little bit of information in my notes, but those of you that have that, there's some superstition and divination involved in this. He's looking for the best time to bring about this plot against the Jews. When will be the fortunate hour that the gods will be pleased to bless my desire to wipe out this people? And yet what does the Word of God say? Proverbs 16 and verse 33, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Who is in control of the lot? God is. And so Haman casts lots, and lo and behold, 1 year from now is going to be the best time. That's going to be the time when all of the demons of hell are going to favor Haman's plot to exterminate the Jews. And God just gave the Jews a year to prepare for this disaster. We come to chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. If you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews, for the Jews, from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. Now, it's chapter 4 that convinces me that the interpretation of this book that makes Esther a compromised collaborator is a wrong read. The name of God may not appear in this text, but very clearly the underpinnings of this entire conversation are covenant and faith. So Mordecai is publicly lamenting, mourning, weeping and wailing, sitting in sackcloth. And many of the Jews throughout the provinces are doing the same as this decree is publicized. You wonder, does Mordecai perhaps feel some level of responsibility? He had let the officials know he was a Jew and that this was somehow connected to his refusal to bow the knee to Haman, his enemy. And now Haman is going to exact vengeance upon all of the Jews because of the offense that he believes Mordecai did against him. But when Esther is sending her servant to inquire about Mordecai, what is wrong and what can be done to help, Mordecai is very bold in instructing Esther, his adopted daughter, to go to the king and plead for mercy, plead for her people, beg the king for deliverance. And he clearly trusts that God will provide that deliverance. See, you can mourn, you can lament and have confidence in God's promises. Don't ever believe that confidence in God's promises mean that you are somehow impervious to disaster and to danger, right? Mordecai is in sackcloth, and yet what does he say? When Esther expresses fearfully that maybe that won't work, the king will put me to death if he doesn't want me to come before him, if I presumptuously go into his presence, I could be killed. And Mordecai says, if you don't, then salvation will arise from some other quarter in some other way. God will not allow His people to be destroyed. That's Mordecai's confidence. And the only way he could have that confidence is based upon the covenant promises that God has made. And so he says to Esther, who knows whether this is why you are here? Who knows whether God has put you in this position for such a time as this? And who can know? In the book of Esther, no one can know. We have said many times before, you are not supposed to read the tea leaves of providence. And Mordecai doesn't. He doesn't say, Esther, clearly this is why you became queen. Clearly this is what has been going on in your life all along. Everything has led up to this moment. It would appear that that is in fact the case. But Mordecai doesn't make some kind of dogmatic, prophetic interpretation of circumstances. He simply poses the question rhetorically, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And what he is calling her to do is act with courage, to act with reverent abandon. Not reckless, but reverent, because God will not allow His people to be destroyed, and who knows but what He may have put you in this position to be able to help save them. And so Esther sends word back to Mordecai and says, have all of the Jews fast for 3 days, and I and my maids will fast, and then I will go into the king, and if I perish, I perish. Now, something you need to know, when God's people fast in Scripture, it is always accompanied by prayer. Always. It's always praying and fasting. So what you have, I think, very clearly is an implicit reference to beseeching God for help here. This is not a secular story the way some want to read it. It's not God working salvation in spite of the worldly and sinful instruments that He has in positions of influence here. Obviously, Esther's sinful and worldly, so am I, so are you. But that's not what we're talking about, right? What you're seeing are people who trust in God's covenant promises, who beseech His blessing through fasting and prayer, and then who act courageously on the basis of His Word. And so chapter 5. Now it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house facing the entrance of the house. So it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom." So Esther answered, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done." Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this: if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, "Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet." And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. When you read about gallows here, by the way, you're not to think about hanging someone with a rope. You're supposed to think about a stake on which you impale someone. That's what's being described. 50 cubits high. It's probably on top of a building or on top of a hill, some elevated structure, so that everyone will be able to see when he positions Mordecai on that stake and impales him through the body and leaves his body on display. Now, here is an interesting question. Did Esther postpone out of wisdom or out of fear? And I'm going to say it just like I said it in chapter 1 and chapter 2. If you get bogged down there, you are missing the point. Either one is possible, right? You could say that maybe she reads the situation and she says, today's not the right day, we need to ask the favor tomorrow. Or maybe she's just afraid. She's a young woman, and this is a terrible situation to be in. By the way, when we read the book of Esther, you should giggle when you read Haman's story. I mean, honestly, he is a ridiculous person. Completely ridiculous, right? You should giggle. But, if you were in Esther's position, you would be terrified. You absolutely would. He is the prime minister of the empire that rules the world. He can put the king's signature on anything he wants to write. He is an extremely powerful, extraordinarily wealthy person. And this is a very dangerous position to be in. Now, as you read the rest of the story, it just so happens that Esther's delay, whether it was the result of wisdom or fear, works very much in everyone's favor except Haman. And so do you see the point? The point is not to get bogged down trying to decide, is Esther a wise believer or is she a fearful unbeliever? You're missing the point. That is not what this story is about. What you're supposed to see is that God, even hiding in the shadows, still has His work done. We go on in chapter 6. That night, the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king asked him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback throughout the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken." So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Why couldn't the king sleep that night? And of all things, I read during the middle of the night when I can't sleep, but I don't read the archives, right? Maybe he's trying to put himself to sleep. And of all that is included in the Medo-Persian records, why was this passage one of the ones that they came to about Mordecai saving the king's life so that the king would then wonder, did we ever do anything for him? We really ought to do something for him. That's kind of a big deal, foiling an assassination plot. And so as the morning dawned and Haman eagerly rushed to the king's palace in order to obtain permission to kill Mordecai, he, in his foolish narcissism, answers the king's question, assuming that the king wants to honor him. Oh, get one of your used robes, get one of your royal horses, have one of your noble princes lead this guy through the capital, telling people that this is the man that the king wants to honor above all others. And the king says, that's a great suggestion. Why don't you go out and do that for Mordecai? Now, at the end of the chapter, as Haman rushes home, ashamed, embarrassed, having his head covered, he wants to hide from public scrutiny. He goes home and he tells his wife what has happened. Some interpreters and some translators would render this in a way that suggests that his wife was trying to comfort him. You say, well, you were disgraced before Mordecai today, but if Mordecai is a Jew, then he will not prevail. But I think the New King James is correct here. I think that what she instead says is prophetic, that she predicts that if in fact Mordecai is a Jew, you're not going to win. You're not going to succeed. Because those troublesome Jews, they always seem to survive. And you have begun to fall, and eventually you will fall completely. We come to chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I am in the house?" As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. You will never have a more exciting scene in any movie you watch, any novel you read. I absolutely love this part of the book. That's the best chapter in all of it, right? They come to the banquet. Remember, Haman was just talking with his wife. She has just made this chilling prediction, and the king's servants show up and say, "Mr. Haman, it's time for the queen's banquet." And he goes into the banquet, and the king says, "Esther, just tell me what you want. I'll be glad to give it to you." And she says, I want you to save my life." "Save your life? What are you talking about?" "I and my people have been sold to be killed. Not enslaved, but annihilated, wiped out of your empire." The king says, "Who would do a thing like that?" And she says, "He would." It's great. It's an awesome scene. And the king is furious, and he is confused, and he goes outside into the garden to clear his head, and Haman begins begging for his life. And the king comes back in, and he's stretched out across. So some commentators think that maybe he's trying to kiss her feet or grab her around the knees and beg for his life, but it's a compromising position. The king comes in and says, what, he's going to assault the queen while I'm here in the house? And as soon as the words left his mouth, you can just see the eunuchs coming up and putting a cloth across his face and pulling him off to be killed. They impale him on the stake that he erected for Mordecai. What does the Bible say? In Psalm 7 and verse 15, he made a pit and dug it out and has fallen into the ditch which he made. That occurs 3 or 4 times, by the way, in your Old Testament. This is the way that we are taught to pray concerning the plots of the enemies of the people of God. God caused them to fall in the pit that they dug for your people. His inappropriate action sealed his fate, and he died in the very way that he intended to kill a servant of the Lord. Now let me go ahead. I know it's a little bit lengthy, but let me go ahead and read the last 3 chapters together. You know the story, but I want you to see all of this history at one time. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who were in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people, or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they've hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke." So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who rode on royal horses went out, hastened, and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan the citadel. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews fell upon them. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On that day, on the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also, Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Erisai, Aridai, and Vazjazatha. The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan the citadel was brought to the king, and the king said to Queen Esther, The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the citadel and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done. Then Esther said, If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed 300 men at Shushan, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This was the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with feasting and gladness as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews, near and far, who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against all the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast pur, that is the lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants, and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. And King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen. All right, now that's the aftermath. That's the actual outcome of the deliverance that God works through Mordecai and Esther on this occasion. Ahasuerus gives the house of Haman to Esther. He gives to Mordecai the signet ring of Haman, and eventually exalts him, elevates him even to the position of prime minister that Haman had once had. But you will remember that the law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed. You saw that in Daniel chapter 6 recently. And so the only way to counteract this is to make a second edict. A second edict that would in some way neutralize the effect of the first. And so they published this decree that on the very day that annihilation had been decreed for the Jewish people, on that day the Jews could assemble, they could take up arms, and they could proactively defend themselves against their enemies. And I want you to understand the difference here is with regard to scale. This is not simply giving the Jews the right to protect themselves if someone breaks into their home, but if they see people gathering together for the purpose of attacking them, they can preemptively attack them. And they can plunder them. In other words, Ahasuerus' decree makes this a matter of war. It's not just a matter of self-defense or a private conflict. This is actually a matter of war. And yet you will see mentioned at least twice in the text that the Jews did not plunder their enemies. Why not? Well, I think in part because this is the rest of the story to 1 Samuel chapter 15. And where Saul had plundered the Amalekites instead of destroying them, the Jews here rightly destroy the Amalekites, so to speak, and do not plunder them. A second day of battle was authorized, and the Feast of Purim was instituted to celebrate it. Now, let me draw your attention to one more thing, and we'll offer a few applications and be done. Throughout this book, you see dates. Every chapter is mentioning in this year, this month, this day. You see the names of people, right? Even insignificant people, right? The sons of Haman, and yet they are named. You see places, you see historical references, even in that final appendix in chapter 10, all of that indicating that the book of Esther is a work of history. This is not allegory, this is not mythology, this is not written after the fact in order to give some historical background for this feast that the Jews celebrate. This is why they celebrate the feast, because this is what happened, and it is properly included in the historical literature of the Bible. Let me suggest 3 applications and then we will close. First, God is in control even when He remains in the shadows. Sometimes He will be in the shadows. You need to know that you will not always see God's presence, perceive His power or His involvement with the same clarity that you might at other times. Sometimes it may seem as if God is not there, and yet even when He is nowhere to be found, He is everywhere. And He is guiding and governing all things to the end that He has appointed. Secondly, God's people must therefore live with reverent abandon. This is the phrase that we've used many times. We're distinguishing it from reckless abandon. You do not tempt the Lord your God. But knowing that God is sovereign, knowing that He works all things together for the good of those who love Him, you trust Him and you act boldly. And you are not to be paralyzed by anxiety, by fears, worrying, overanalyzing constantly as if somehow the future depends upon your wise actions. The future depends on the outworking of God's promises. And so you make wise choices, you pray for wisdom, you seek godly counsel, you pray that God will bless it, but you move forward. Who knows whether you came to the kingdom for such a time as this? They don't know that definitively, but they're going to live with confidence because God is not going to allow His people to be destroyed. And that's the third point. God will not allow His promises to fail. How did Mordecai know that the Jews would not be exterminated? He knew it because Messiah had not come. He knew the Jews could not be destroyed because Jesus had not yet come. Now that didn't mean that many of the Jews could not be killed. Obviously they could be. They're in exile, right? Even though some have returned to the homeland, Mordecai and Esther are in Persia, right? They're not in Judea for a reason. God had punished His people and sent them away from the promised land. Bad things can happen. God's people can suffer, but God's promises cannot fail. And so those 3 applications tie very closely together. God is in control even when He does not seem to be present. Therefore, we are called to trust Him and live with reverent abandon. It may look reckless to the world. It may put us in significant danger. It certainly did put Esther in that kind of danger. And yet we trust God and we act courageously because we know, third, God's promises will not fail. He will work all things together for the good of those who love Him. And better to live in this way, better to die in that way than to live in fear. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. All right? Okay. That was super quick, and yet we still went way over time, so I appreciate your patience. But really and truly, the best thing you can do with the book of Esther is read it in one sitting. Read it aloud, read it with an audio Bible, visualize the story. Do not read this book by chapters. Just read it at one go because it's one of the most exciting stories you'll see in all of Scripture.